tonight, we're very excited to be focusing on poems. And we're going to begin with Dr. Mona Narain, who will be taking us on a tour and discussion of To the University of Cambridge in New England. And then I'll be second tonight, and I'm going to be looking at Phillis Wheatley's poem to George Washington that she sent to him directly and personally in 1775, and his response, and also her poem Liberty and Peace, which is an example of a publication that she signed as Phillis Peters. So it's after her marriage. And then Barbara will be have the wonderful opportunity to share with you a poem by June Jordan, something like a sonnet for Phillis Miracle Wheatley. And then we'll have a breakout where we'll look at some contemporary poets who have been inspired by Wheatley Peters. And the two that we've chosen for tonight, Allison Clark and Drea Brown, we have a few poems from each of them. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mona. And I'm going to join with you in being excited to hear about the poem that she's going to share with us.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. Can you hear me just fine? Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And I just want to say that we are really cognizant of the important work that Humanities Texas is doing. And thank you for inviting us to do this webinar. And my colleagues, of course, my talented, wonderful colleagues, Barbara McCaskill and Sarah Ruffing Robbins. But also thank you to you for doing the important work that you're doing. And this poem is about that. It's about the power of learning. And Phillis Wheatley Peters, let's say, her call for recognizing the importance of knowledge. And so without further ado, I'm actually going to read the poem aloud. I think there's power in reading poetry aloud. So, to the University of Cambridge in New England. While an intrinsic ardor prompts to write, the muses promise to assist my pen. 'Twas not long since I left my native shore, the land of errors and Egyptian gloom. Father of mercy, 'twas thy gracious hand brought me in safety from those dark abodes. Students, to you 'tis given to scan the heights above, to traverse the ethereal space and mark the systems of revolving worlds. Still more, ye sons of science, ye receive the blissful news by messengers from heaven, how Jesus' blood for your redemption flows. See him with hands outstretched upon the cross, immense compassion in his bosom glows. He hears revilers, nor resents their scorn. What matchless mercy in the Son of God. When the whole human race by sin had fallen, he deigned to die that they may rise again and share with him. I beg your pardon, I'm going to pause here because my screen is in the middle. And share with him in the sublimest skies, life without death and glory without end. Improve your privileges while they stay, ye pupils, and each hour redeem that bears, or good or bad report of you to heaven. Let sin, that baneful evil to the soul, by you be shunned, nor once remit your guard. Suppress the deadly serpent in its egg, ye blooming plants of human race divine. And Ethiop tells you 'tis your greatest foe. Its transient sweetness turns to endless pain, and an immense perdition sinks the soul. So the reason why we chose this poem together, and especially by my desire, is because it's a really unique poem in many ways in Phillis Wheatley Peters' writing. First of all, despite the fact that she wrote in neoclassical verse, very tight metrical stanzas, this poem is unusual in that it adopts an irregular metrical scheme. And she only uses rhyme to connect ideas, such as flow or glow, and alliteration when she talks about deign to die or this sublimest skies. And this represents the fact that this poem is full of paradoxes and contrasts. So let's think about what those may be. First, at the opening of the poem, she acknowledges that she does have a pagan past. And she also acknowledges that she was redeemed by the Christianity that she has embraced. But then she turns around and with irony, she asks the audience, the white audience that she's primarily addressing this poem to, and certainly to the students at Harvard, are you free of sin? Are you going to receive redemption? Because as Christians, you have been enslaving people. And so that's the really serious question that she asks in the poem right from the very beginning. And in doing so, she brings together the tensions and possibilities of her very difficult position, writing as an enslaved woman to these white men who have the privilege of going to Harvard, one of the most important and celebrated universities in the land, who have access to the best of knowledge that she herself will never have access to. And so she says that I am an Ethiop, I'm an Afrik, right? And she uses Egypt as sort of representative of Africa here. And she calls it the land of gloom, which has been redeemed by Christianity once, she comes to North America. But she talks about the fact that poetry is her intrinsic talent. So it's not as though poetry only belongs to North America. She has the intrinsic right to write. And that is the possibility that she presents to us in this poem, despite the fact of being pagan, so to speak. And ultimately, the poem is very much about the value of knowledge and learning. And so many times we're in the classroom and our students think, why are we reading this? And this is why, because Phillis Wheatley Peters tells us that the power of learning and knowledge has the possibility not just of enlightenment, but of redemption itself. And so she says that you have been given the opportunity to learn, O students of Harvard, but have you embraced this privilege? What are you going to do with it when you walk those halls of privilege? And are you going to embrace divinity, the power of divinity that is intrinsic to knowledge itself, and to redeem yourself? So in that sense, it's a poem of great courage, if you think about it, right? She's an enslaved woman who is writing to a white audience, and she picks up a really important historical question of the time. Should the enslaved who have embraced Christianity be free, right? What is it that distinguishes one Christian from another? And she's making an argument very much so that she's as enlightened and as on the pathway to redemption as any other Christian. And so it is that tension that lies at the core of this poem that she really talks about in terms of addressing the most enlightened, the most intellectual of North America. And what I wanted to give for you is a little bit of context, a little historical context. And this is a primary historical document that is on the Google Classroom cache for you. And this is a very important case that was decided in Great Britain in 1772, and it was called the Somerset versus Stuart. The central question of this case was, can enslaved persons, in this case, James Somerset, for whom this case was brought, if they are on English soil, can they be forcibly removed and sent back to their enslavers, whether it's in the Caribbean or in North America? And the answer is that Lord Mansfield, the judge who was presiding on behalf of the English Court of Kings on 22nd of June in 1772, says categorically, no, you cannot re-enslave a person on English soil and forcibly send them back to their enslavers. And I'll just read a couple of lines from this case. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reason, moral or political, but only by positive law. And then he goes on to say, whatever inconvenience therefore may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black, in this case it's Somerset that he is referring to, must be discharged. And so drawing on this, this is the time very likely when she's writing a number of the poems that are included in the 1773 book that we have been referring to, her book of poetry that was published in 1773. This is the context in which she's writing. And the colonies have, of course, said that no, we are not going to simply free the enslaved just because they have embraced Christianity. Whereas on English soil, Lord Mansfield, at least as the beginning of abolition in England, has said that no, you cannot re-enslave somebody who has arrived on English soil. So in that sense, Wheatley Peters is also referring to these historical contexts in this poem. It is without doubt that her readers would be aware of Somerset v. Stuart. And then she takes up the issue of Christianity, redemption, enslavement, and very importantly, her authority to write and to be considered a poet. And it's a poem of great pluck and force. And at this point in time, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who will pick up right at that point.
Sarah, you're muted there.
That we're doing. I just want to mention before we start the that the anniversary year of 1773, 2023 is the guiding anchor of our work this year. And remind you that you can go to any of these three links to see the entire book of poetry from 1773. The A link takes you to Internet Archive, where there are actually multiple copies from different years. Hathi Trust also has very accessible copies. But I want to again really salute the wonderful online exhibit that's been prepared at St. Andrews University that includes not only pages from the original, but also artifacts such as the library sign-out sheets from students. Speaking of students, and one reason I wanted to mention this again because of Mona zeroing in on students from Wheatley's own lifetime, students at St. Andrews University, a very old university, were already checking out the book in the late 18th century. And then also, again, just to remind you that there are a lot of resources in the Google Classroom for working on the book itself as an artifact and its history, including resources to help you think about the frontispiece image, which is so famous. But I'm actually going to focus tonight on two poems that were not in the book, two poems from later in Phillis Wheatley's life when things had changed in her situation. And the first one I'm going to look at is her poem to George Washington. And I've got two dates here, 1775, because that's the date when she wrote the poem and sent it directly to Washington. And 1776 is its first publication. And here's some significant topics that I discuss with students when I teach this poem, and reasons why I think it's good to teach. One is that it's a great example of how poetry circulated within personal networks during this time period, not just in print publication. And often poems would circulate to a small group of people, friends, family, neighbors, and then it might eventually see print And that's what happened in this case. She sent the poem to Washington. He read it. He actually responded to it. He wrote back to her. And then eventually in 1776 is its first publication. I also think it's good for students to know that there's poetry beyond that 1773 book, right? That's not the only stuff that Phillis Wheatley wrote. Also, both this poem and Liberty and Peace show us the shifting political context for Phillis Wheatley Peters' writings. By 1775, we have the Revolutionary War going on, and her sense of who she is shifting, just as the larger context is shifting. So she goes from writing a poem in praise of King George to a poem praising a different George, George Washington. And we can see within the poem signs of her shift in identity and political affiliation. At the same time, though, we can see consistencies in her use of poetic craft. And so I think those are interesting to talk about for students. Now, the whole poem is there for you in Google Classroom, but I want to look at just an excerpt from the poem and the letter that she sent to Washington along with the poem. So here's the letter. Sir, I have taken the freedom to address your excellency in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. You're being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excited sensations that may not be easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon this attempt. Wishing your excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am your excellency's most obedient, humble servant, Phillis Wheatley, Providence, October 26, 1775. Now, we could spend an hour just on this letter. There's so much to talk about here. One question that I ask students right away is, why is it important to notice the date? 1775 tells us it's after the book of poems in 1773. It also tells us the Revolutionary War is going on. And notice she's no longer in Boston, she's in Providence. This is after the death of John and Susanna Wheatley, and she has moved. I also asked them to think about word choice in the letter. And you might remember last time we noted in the preface how she describes herself as a humble author and asks her readers pardon for intruding into their lives with her writing. And I mentioned that's a convention. It's not unique to Wheatley. She's following a convention. And we see that here. She's sort of saying to Washington, pardon me for intruding, and I hope that you will accept my humble gift to you with its inaccuracies. So going through and picking those words out. At the same time, though, noticing the words she ascribes to him. Generalissimo, for instance, highlighting the virtues that he has, and just the way that she is praising him in this letter, which is then echoed in the poem. And an interesting setup in the first part of the poem, which again you will find in the Google Classroom, is that a number of the poem's lines set up a contrast between the figure of Columbia, whom Wheatley associates with the emerging nation, and Britannia, a stand-in for Great Britain, whom Wheatley critiques for having cruel blindness to Columbia's state, and therefore making her lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. So thinking about the characterization of Columbia in the poem and the association of Columbia with an emerging nation and with Washington is one of the things that I do when I teach this poem. There's an implicit related contrast between Washington and the other George, right? Between Washington as a leader and King George. And associated with that is the idea that Washington is now the right and righteous symbol of America's or Columbia's new role and potential reign. So let's just look quickly at the closing lines of the poem that she speaks directly to Washington. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine with gold unfading. Washington, be thine. Yeah. Well, again, this is a place where word choice is really important, and students can gain a lot by asking themselves, what do we make of her calling Washington a great chief? Again, echoing that word virtue, which she used in the letter. Who is the goddess that is the guide? And that refers back to earlier in the poem, and we want to talk about that. But one of the most interesting things, I think, is what she's offering Washington: a crown, a mansion, and a throne. And what does that mean? What does she mean when she's offering these things to Washington? And if we set that in historical context, we know that there were people urging Washington to become a king, right? So what's going on here? Related texts to help study this poem, and also interesting to study on their own, really important, I think, is to look at Washington's response to Wheatley. He wrote her a letter back and he praised her. He praised her poem. He praised her learning. He praised her classical education, and how different that is from the way Thomas Jefferson characterizes her. So you will see in the Google Classroom, I've created a Word file named Wheatley, Washington, and Jefferson. And in that file, I have excerpts I have Washington's letter back to her. I also have excerpts from Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia and his characterization of Wheatley as incapable of writing good poetry. In fact, any Black people being incapable of writing good poetry, according to Jefferson. And then I also would contextualize with the Liberty and Peace poem that came out in 1784, right around the same time as notes on the state of Virginia from Jefferson. And this is a fascinating poem to look at in connection with the Washington one. You'll see some recurring words there that are interesting to look at between the two poems. And again, I want to just highlight the closing lines where she lists other nations around the globe that should be admiring the new United States and should then therefore be celebrating Columbia. And then she closes by saying, auspicious heaven shall fill with favoring gales where'er Columbia spreads her swelling sails. To every realm shall peace her charms display, and heavenly freedom spread her golden ray. Well, again, so much to talk about here. Again, notice the use of italics and what she italicizes, Columbia twice, but also the word peace and the word freedom. It's a very optimistic poem. She's envisioning a future for the new nation that will promote peace, and she's envisioning freedom. And wow, think about that last line, heavenly freedom spreading her golden ray. It's not just for the nation, it's also for her. And it's for the ending of the enslavement of Blacks in the new nation and a hope for the new nation. So I think that's a good point to close on and hand over at this point to my colleague, Barbara McCaskill, who will go up even further into time for us and look at a more recent poem.
All right, can everyone see this? Okay, thank you for having me back again. I am very excited to share with you one of my absolute favorite contemporary poems about Phillis Wheatley. And the poem is called Something Like a Sonnet for Phillis Miracle Wheatley by the late, great June Jordan. I'm going to tell you a little bit about June Jordan and a little background to the poem before actually going into the poem itself and covering some highlights about what I say when I teach the poem. June Jordan is a fabulous poet of many talents who really came of age during two cultural moments: the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century and the women's rights movement of the mid-20th century. And her poetry, which spans roughly from the 1980s through the first couple of decades of the 2000s, she dies in early 2000s, they cover very much these topics of gender and race. She also was a social critic. She was very interested in issues of equality, issues of equity, making the invisible groups of people visible, not only in the United States, but globally. And her poems touch upon such global issues as the apartheid issue in South Africa and the United States and other countries' roles in both dismantling apartheid and at times being complicit in apartheid. She was very concerned about issues that still concern us today, issues such as adequate housing for people, feeding the hungry, giving young people around the world access to strong educations and the ability to pursue higher education. She also was very interested in African American and diasporic African history and what the histories of earlier figures like Phillis Wheatley have to say to us in the 20th and then in the 21st centuries about our own progress towards equality and social transformation. This sonnet, Something Like a Sonnet for Phillis Miracle Wheatley, was initially published in a collection of new and selected poems that June Jordan published in 1985 called Naming Our Destiny. And the poem, Something Like a Sonnet for Phillis Miracle Wheatley, came at the very end in the last section of this collection of poems in a section titled The North Star. And I really like to call students' attention to that because it speaks to the ultimate positivity and optimism of this poem. This poem calls attention in quite blunt and direct terms to the enslavement of Phillis Wheatley, but it also gestures to, as my colleagues have pointed out, her freedom and the possibilities for the development of African American potential that liberation stood to offer to all emancipated Africans. There is an essay that accompanies the poem in Naming Our Destiny called The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America. It's rather long, so depending on the age level of your students, you might want to summarize the key points as I have. This sets us up for an understanding as readers of the sonnet itself. And mainly what this essay calls attention to is June Jordan's understanding of Phillis Wheatley as a metonym, a part that represents the whole, as a metonym for African Americans past and present. That is how she thinks about Phillis Wheatley in her sonnet, Something Like a Sonnet. She thinks about Phillis Wheatley's actual historical life, but Jordan thinks about how the circumstances of Phillis Wheatley's enslavement and her struggles to be an artist in spite of that call attention to the history of African Americans facing challenges over 3 centuries and more. There are certain sentences in this essay that June Jordan repeats that also have resonance in the sonnet itself, as you shall see. And these sentences that are repetitive in the essay are, "It was not natural," referring to Phillis Wheatley's creative genius that manifested in spite of slavery. "Was it a nice day?" referring to low points in Phillis Wheatley's life, such as when she was kidnapped from Africa to America, and when she had difficulties with her marriage and her children and creating stability in her family in freedom. And my favorite sentence in this essay is the sentence, "and yet we persist." Because finally, what June Jordan suggests in this essay is that Phillis Wheatley Peters comes down to us over time as an enduring symbol of resilience. Female resilience, African American resilience, American resilience. She speaks to a variety of constituencies. it's often very useful to do a quick review of the various sonnets with one's students. And I have arced out here, and you will see this in your Google Classroom for reference, the many different kinds of sonnets. For the purposes of something like a sonnet for Phillis Miracle Wheatley, June Jordan's poetry, you want to think about how June Jordan is adapting the Shakespearean, otherwise known as Elizabethan or English sonnet form, which consists of 3 quatrains, typically 3 groupings of 4 lines, and a final couplet, 2 lines that rhyme, a kind of call out to Phillis Wheatley's use of couplets, if you will. June Jordan's poem, however, is titled Something Like a Sonnet. So you can, after this brief review of sonnet forms, ask your students to look at the poem carefully and think about ways in which June Jordan is stepping away from the traditional sonnet form, and in that way making a declaration about Phillis Wheatley's own innovation, her own creativity, as my colleagues have shown, her own ability to work within received forms of rhyme and prosody and vocabulary, and at the same time to innovate within those forms. June Jordan is also doing something of the same thing. So I'm going to read this poem and call attention to a few key talking points that you might want to raise with your students. Girl from the realm of birds florid and fleet, flying full feather in far or near weather, who fell to a dollar lust coffled like meat, captured by avarice and hate spit together, trembling asthmatic alone on the slave block, built by a savagery, traveling by carriage, viewed like a species of flaw in the livestock, a child without safety of mother or marriage, chosen by whimsy but born to surprise. They taught you to read, but you learned how to write, begging the universe into your eyes. They dressed you in light, but you dreamed with the night. From Africa, singing of justice and grace, your early verse sweetens the fame of our race. You can hear, as I read this poem, the way in which June Jordan uses pacing in those first 2 quatrains, those first 8 lines, in order to create a sense of quickness, of swiftness. There is no end punctuation in those first 8 lines. And those 8 lines focus on the misery of Wheatley's being kidnapped from slavery, but even worse than that, the worst horror, as many of the writers of the slave narratives used to say of slavery, was how it dismembered, it amputated us as Black people from our families. And this is what June Jordan is using sound and pace to call attention to. The whirlwind of change, the sense of chaos that Phillis Wheatley Peters experienced as a young child kidnapped from the region of Senegambia. She uses alliteration, the repetition of sounds, so that we read very quickly and we are invited to feel the dislocation that Phillis Wheatley Peters would have felt. You can call attention with your students to the use of verb forms in these first 8 lines, what we call participles, verbs that are used adjectivally to describe Wheatley and to describe the landscape of Africa that she left. Flying full feather to describe the birds of the African continent. Captured by avarice. Trembling, asthmatic, alone, traveling by carriage. These are participle phrases, verbs being used as adjectives. invite your students to look for the patterns among these verbs, and very quickly they will see that most of these verb forms, these verb phrases used as adjectives, are ing verbs. Traveling, for example, trembling. And that is not coincidental. As a poet, June Jordan understands that any word with ing, traveling, flying, trembling, refers to action that is not yet completed. And by that, Jordan is moving the poem in two directions. Yes, Phillis Wheatley Peters' kidnapping was completed. But on the other hand, what remained incomplete was the development of her creativity, was the development of her potential, was the development of her art. And by extension, if we can understand Phillis Wheatley as a symbol for African American creativity, what June Jordan is using these ongoing action style words to suggest is that African Americans as a race, if you will, as a group, still have not demonstrated our full potential in this country. There's so much more that we can offer. And she emphasizes that in the next few lines. This sonnet, by the way, is 15 lines, not 14. And something like a sonnet, again, gesturing to Phillis Wheatley's innovativeness, her creativity, her willingness to step outside of convention. We see in those next few lines the contradiction. Born to surprise, but you learned how to write, but you dreamed with the night. Again, suggesting ways in which Phillis Wheatley surprised her enslavers and surprised the pre-colonial world by becoming a great poet. Again, think about the punctuation, how those last two couplets slow us down. Your early verse sweetens the fame of our race. They remind us actually of the sound of Phillis Wheatley's poetry, and they thus gesture to Phillis Wheatley. I like to also compare June Jordan's adaptation, if you will, of Phillis Wheatley's life and poetry to Phillis Wheatley's best-known poem on being brought from Africa to America. I don't have time to go into much detail here, but I will invite you to ask your students to think about the ways in which Wheatley also uses irony and contradiction, similar to what Mona showed us in how she calls out the Christians around her, holding them up to high standards, even as she avows that they enslave people. That sense of irony that June Jordan embraces also gestures back to the irony that Phillis Wheatley Peters uses. That willingness to claim racial identity. June Jordan ends her poem with the word race. And by the way, that's the only word that June Jordan capitalizes. Note how Phillis Wheatley, in the style of her day, capitalizes many nouns for emphasis. June Jordan only capitalizes one, and that is race. And that's the very last word of her poem. And in doing so, what June Jordan does metaphorically is give the black voice, Peters, the last word. And she also, by calling attention to the word race, by capitalizing it, what June Jordan does is again emphasize the power and the endurance, and as she pointed out in her essay, the persistence of the race in spite of challenges, in spite of obstacles, in spite of low expectations. I guarantee your students will enjoy this poem, and I do hope that you teach it. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing.
So we thought it would be great fun now to take some time in smaller groups and talk about some of the poetry by Drea Brown and Allison Clark. And I put in the chat a link to the Google Classroom in case you haven't had a chance to download those two clusters of excerpts from their two books. Drea Brown's book, Dear Girl, A Reckoning, is a chapbook. It's a collection of poems held together with the particular theme. In this case, she's looking at the experience of the middle passage, which is something that, as we've seen, Wheatley herself alludes to occasionally, but doesn't engage with directly and fully. So this is a gap in the biography that Drea Brown enters and addresses in her collection. And we've selected several poems from the collection and put them in Google Classroom, and we'll talk about them in a minute in the breakout. And then the other artist that we've selected to call to your attention is Allison Clark. She's a Canadian, and her book is called Phillis. It initially began as her MFA project, and it's a very different style from Drea Brown. You will have seen she writes more prose poems. And I would also say Allison Clark looks at the full arc of Wheatley Peters' life, whereas Drea selects the middle passage as her focus. So we've chosen a couple of poems by Allison and a few poems by Drea to talk about in the breakouts. And if you don't already have them handy, we'll read them in a minute with you in the breakout, but you can also go to that link. And Elizabeth has additionally helpfully put them in the chat, so you can click on them there and download them. And we're now going to ask Elizabeth to put us into 3 breakout groups so that we can talk a bit about these poems.
Lisa here has been very gracious in agreeing to present. Lisa, would you like to share what we talked about, please? Thank you so much.
Sure. I will try to keep it succinct, not always my strong suit. So our group had really interesting conversation and really enjoyed reading the poetry out of both books. I think we spent a little bit more time out of the Drea Brown book. I know one thing we talked about, at least that I kind of mentioned that I liked, is I like The Dead Will Have Their Due. I love that poem because to me it talks about justice, and how they're kind of finding justice through death. And so even though they've lost so much, they still have their voice still carries on in some way or another. We talked about how, and just like when you lose a limb, you still have that pain there. They lost parts of their identity, parts of their soul was literally hacked away, literally and figuratively hacked away through all the trauma and abuse they went through. But they're saying, but we're still going to have our say, our day. They still have justice kind of in death, which most people I think of as death as dark and gloomy, and where is there any light in death? But in death they found justice, I feel like. But then when we read the other poem, if I can get it back on my screen, the other poem, it was much lighter, the one that had that kind of hope, where she talks about being a griot, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, how she finally got to, I guess, still use her, like she went through slavery, she went through trauma and abuse, but she still had that part of her identity of passing down the oral tradition that I think probably still connected her with her roots. And so I think that was really special. And that poem to me seemed much more hopeful. So we kind of discussed the juxtaposition of those two poems and how these poems would be great used in a history class to kind of give the background of each of the writers, and then take that literary piece and apply it to what they're learning in history, which just gives it more meaning overall. And then we also talked about how it's nice to read poetry that's not so cut and dry and simple. Like, I was a slave, here's what I went through. It's all doom and gloom and bad. Instead we see like full circle, the lives of these people, what they went through, their identities, kind of beginning to end. You went through this, but you came out a griot. You're like, you're sharing this poetry, you're sharing these stories. You still did it, mom and dad. I still did it, mom and dad. Like, that's pretty special. So it's kind of interesting. These poems, they have so much to them. And then we also talked a little bit about the way the poems are on the page, like for Dear Reader, the way that Drea puts it on the page. And that's something that Mona says. That's not my credit. But the way it's written, the format. I was trying to look it on the screen while I was talking. So I don't know. Did I cover everything, Mona? Am I good for our group?
That was brilliant. I want to share that Drea and Allison reading their own poems is really powerful, and we do have a video on the website for the project where they're reading. Barbara, you want to invite somebody from your group to share?
Well, I'm going to invite the other person that spoke. My group was listening more than speaking, but I will invite Joe to share his observations and comments.
Yeah, so sorry, I feel like I monopolized this one. I'm sorry to the people in my group. I got really fascinated by the Drea Brown poem, the very first one, "Dear Reader," where she goes on a lot, quite a lot. Like she uses the words ghosts, banshees, haints, apparitions. She keeps talking, and we had this great conversation about this idea of sort of the spirit world, this idea that we're surrounded by these ideas of ghosts. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Kind of like what Lisa said about this notion of death. It's not in and of itself. Maybe in a modern context, we have a more negative connotation applied to that. I was very intrigued by the use of the word, specifically the use of the word haint. My Appalachian grandmother. So I have this connection to the culture that was very much in the idea of spirits and magic, and that like those were real things that were in the world around you. And she used that word frequently, and I didn't know the etymology of it at all. I assumed it was of Appalachian origin, but maybe not. I guess apparently not, that it's an idea adopted by my ancestors.
And I had said that I had only heard it used in relationship to the Deep South. So I learned something new. I'd never heard of Appalachian people using haint before. But we found out that the connotations are very similar, right?
Very similar.
The idea of the boundaries being blurred between the living and the dead. And I liked what Joe invited us to think about in relationship to hauntings, the idea that the ghosts are a metaphor for history.
Yeah.
And how we are haunted by our unresolved histories that we have not come to terms with, have not fully reckoned with. It's just a powerful evocation of that. And I told him and the rest of the group that Drea's poem really keeps circling back beautifully to that idea of ghosts and spirits. Literally, Wheatley is surrounded by the dead and dying on the middle passage. But as she matures, those ghosts become the ghost of memory, the ghost of history, the ghost of the past. And for the readers, us, right? They're the ghosts of our history that we cannot fully exercise from our lives.
Before I ask, and I'll give you a heads up with Tende, I'm going to ask you to say a few things about our conversation, but I just want to remind everyone in the chat, I've put a link to the big project website. And one last reminder that our writing contest deadline is this Friday night. And the second link takes you to the page with directions. And I know back when I was teaching middle and high school, this kind of night, I would have loved to go in the next day and do stuff in class right away. So I encourage you just to give tomorrow to your students to do some writing. We have some great samples on the website that you can draw on, and you have so much to take into your classroom tomorrow from these discussions tonight. I'm so proud of all of you and have learned so much from all of you. Thank you for that. Watende, you wanna maybe get the last word just quickly? I know our time's almost up. What are some thoughts that you have from our breakout?
It was just when we were reading Girl on the Deck of Terror and Wonder, and we had a great conversation on the line refuse, gift, commodity, and how that just brought out, that could have been a blessing in disguise for her to have been refused by other slave owners. That refusal put her in a position where she could have been, where she was educated, and earned her freedom, where other slave owners may not have been as generous with her, for lack of a better word. And then how, Velasa, I'm going to throw you out there, because you talked about commodity and how she felt herself being a commodity. And just those three words together just summed up a whole journey, a true journey. And then the last word of the poem, America's. America's what? America's daughter? Is it America's burden? Is it America's shame? But, you know, what is it when we see that one word, America, and how is it applied in this instance? There's a multitude of meanings that could be added into it. And I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional, but a multitude of meanings that could be added into it. And you just don't know where to start or where to define it.
Thank you. That's a great way to put a punctuation mark on our conversations tonight. I just loved every bit of it. I know, Elizabeth, you need to send us on our way in a minute, but I want to speak for my friends, Barbara and Mona, if you'll let me, and say how grateful we are for this evening.
Yes. I would also just like to add, there's more Wheatley out there. This morning, the Smithsonian National African American History Museum, National Museum of African American History and Culture, to be exact, of the Smithsonian Institution, has announced an acquisition of rare manuscripts associated with Phillis Wheatley, including a manuscript copy of her poem Oceans, other editions of her book. So if you can get to DC, this is the time to go to DC. Speaking of punctuating this conversation.
Thank you all so much. Thank you to our three faculty for such fantastic sessions. And we're just so pleased that you were here to lead us in these discussions and celebrate this important anniversary.